every country is in debt, who do they actually owe the money to?
Governments around the world are addicted to debt.
The sovereign debt levels globally have just grown exponentially.
Exploding debt is a real worry if you're an investor.
Have you ever asked yourself, with all the countries of the world under debt, who really owns all this debt? It is a question that people do not usually have an answer to, which is buried deep under the economic terms and political speeches. However, it is important to know to whom the debt of the world belongs, since this brings out the interests that will dominate our world globally in future. Today, we are going to lift the curtain and look at what actually goes on when nations borrow billions and who profits at it. You do not need to be a genius to hear the news about a country piling unbelievable amounts of debt, sometimes even in trillions of dollars, and ask yourself, what is this all about? Conflicting stories about devaluations, default rates, and economical roles are just the tip of the iceberg, as behind these headlines there exists a dark realm of lenders, investors, and other institutions whose shade is much more influential than numerals. By the time this video is over, you will clearly understand exactly who debt actually runs on the world into, and why this issue will be of interest to you. Since we all tend to live in a globalized world, the waves of debt touch all ends of our economies, our communities, and our lives.
Let's face it, the world is addicted to debt. Pretty much every country, leaving Germany aside, has very large amounts of government borrowing.
We've started to take it as so normal now that governments borrow enormous amounts of money relative to their GDP.
The US, Japan, Canada, Italy, France, all of these countries have very high debt levels by historical standards.
Just to begin with the simplest of the facts. So what is national debt really? A country also has to borrow money when it is spending more money than it is earning in revenue, whether this is in the form of taxes, exports, or any other method. This borrowing would usually finance big projects, road construction, hospitals, schools, or delivery of social services. Governments emit something also known as bonds, which basically is an IOU, indicating that it owes us some money. It ensures the money will be returned along with interest. However, the national debt is not like a loan such as your credit card or your mortgage. It belongs to a global, complex financial ecosystem that links countries, financial institutions, investors, and financial markets in the global environment. Consider the debt of a given country as a huge, intricate book of accounts. It keeps changing, and ownership transfers between various holders on a daily, worldwide basis.
The US federal government spent $880 billion on debt interest last year. That's 4 times the level of a decade ago, and it's more than they spend on the military, almost as much as they spend on health. If the way that you pay for debt is to issue more debt, you're vulnerable to a rise in interest rates, and that's exactly what's happened.
It's approaching 25% of all revenues just to pay back the debt. And that is the classic debt trap, right? It's a hole that you can't dig out of, and you can't inflate your way out.
Well, the US is running an enormous deficit, about 6% of GDP, which in peacetime, at full employment, remember, is extraordinary. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. And the trajectory for US debt, if you look at standard forecasts, I mean, it's very, very disturbing. Since it's the most important country with the most important currency.
The projected amount of debt that has to be sold, which equals the deficit, is 7.5% of GDP. And at existing interest rates, that raises also debt service a lot. So it's right at that precipice. I think the way that you address this issue is you make a bipartisan, cross-party lines commitment to 3% of GDP.
The big question now, since we owe money and all countries owe money, who owns the debts? The first thing that comes to mind when one thinks about who may be holding the world debt is some dark figure or some one big bank. However, this is not the case, and it gets more complicated and fascinating as well. Mostly, debt is in the hands of the combination of local and foreign investors, such as to governments themselves. As an example, the US government owns a share of its own debt, including things such as the Social Security Trust Fund. banks and financial institutions. Banks in this case means large banks who will purchase government bonds as secure investment. Pension funds and insurance companies, they invest in government debt as it is regarded to be of low risk. Private investors, affluent people worldwide, mutual funds and hedge funds. Foreign government, countries have the use of lending money to each other by buying bonds. America, like in the case of China, has a considerable amount of debt with China. Then there are international bodies such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. Though their main asset is providing loans to the developing states in need, by means of aid and bailout sectors, they also directly or indirectly possess or control a large percentage of international debts. These players have different interests. Investors and banks want constant returns. Governments engage in debt as an instrument of stimulus or satisfy budget deficits. However, when combined, they form a widespread lending network that is both interconnected and makes up the pillars of the global economy.
And government debt, really is more important now than ever. What we're seeing here is, record levels of national debt, of debt to GDP ratio. Our net interest payments have exceeded spending on national defense, deficits, hitting $1 billion. And people are wondering, what can we do about it? And, you have some folks out there, like I'm going to pick on Paul Krugman, for example, who say debt is just money we owe to ourselves. And that is definitely not the case.
Who is carrying the debt is what is important. Debt holders have actual power because of this. When the nation is in debt to investors in billions and trillions, the investors can as well be termed to have a stake in the economy of that particular nation. They have the right to influence the interest rates, the terms of repayment, and even to indirectly influence political decisions of a country. Consider such a crisis as the Eurozone one a few years ago. Nations such as Greece were in a deep, heavy debt, not only in its own citizens but also other banks and governments in other countries. The bailout loans came with conditions that Greece had to ensure that it adhered to the harsh austerity measures which affected millions of lives. Such a dynamic casts deep doubts on the world of sovereignty, fair, and economic justice. In instances when creditors can affect state policy, can you call it a democratic state or country with a democratic government?
They say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Have Europeans made the most of this one? Another last chance summit to save Greece underway, and according to who you believe, it's also a summit to save the euro.
Greece has witnessed a remarkable 37% surge in property purchases by Indian investors between July and August. This flurry of activity is driven by Indian buyers eager to secure permanent residency under Greece's Golden Visa program, before, of course, significant regulatory changes took effect on September the 1st.
We might think of government debt as a distant issue, something that only politicians and economists worry about, but it deeply affects everyone. When governments spend a large chunk of their budgets servicing debt, that is, paying interest to lenders, they have less to invest in public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This can influence the quality of life for millions. Moreover, economic crises triggered by debt defaults or financial instability can lead to job losses, inflation, and even social unrest. Understanding who holds debt helps us understand the pressures governments face and the trade-offs they must make. Global debt levels are at historic highs. Events like the COVID-19 pandemic have forced countries to borrow even more just to keep economies afloat. This raises important questions. Can this debt spiral continue indefinitely? How will the relationships between debtors and creditors evolve? Will new financial players or technologies disrupt the traditional debt market? While the future is uncertain, one thing is clear. Knowledge about the players involved gives us power as citizens and consumers in a connected world. If you've gained a deeper understanding of the world's debt system and who holds the strings, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more insightful explorations into economics and global affairs. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Who do you think should have more say when it comes to global debt? Drop a comment below and join the discussion. Debt is more than just numbers on a page. a living network that shapes nations and affects millions of lives. Behind every debt statistic are real people making decisions, taking risks, and hoping for a better future. By asking questions and seeking clarity, we take the first step toward a more informed, empowered world. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, and until next time, take care.